What I want to do is, at a very high level, focus on some of the business implications of all these exponential technologies. Just about this point in time in these kinds of gatherings, there's a sense of being overwhelmed by the technology and a set of questions around, okay, this is amazing, now what do I do? All of us, all of our companies, are going to face the challenge of fundamental transformation. This isn't just incremental innovation or modifications on the edge. It is fundamental transformation of a large company. In that context, I've been involved in large-scale transformation efforts now for over 30 years. I have only one lesson to share with you in all of that experience. And that lesson is that if you believe that large-scale transformation is a rational process, if you believe that it's about gathering the right data, doing the right analytics, putting it into the right charts, presenting it to the right people, you've already lost. My humble opinion, we can debate and discuss at the fireside chat, but my experience is it is not a rational process at all. It is fundamentally a political process. And it really only has three objectives. Objective number one, identify and neutralize, by all means necessary, the enemies of change. That is not as easy as it sounds, because I will tell you again from my experience, and maybe you've had different experiences, but from my experience, I have never been in a senior leadership meeting of a company where an executive has stood up and announced, I am an enemy of change. Hasn't happened. What happens is they sit around the table, look at the charts, smile, nod at each other, say, yes, we need to change, and then they go back into the privacy of their offices to conspire to figure out how to undermine the process of change. So identifying the enemies of change is non-trivial. Second objective, identify and strengthen, by all means possible, the champions of change. And then there's a third objective, and here I take great inspiration from a book that I hope many of you have read. I would certainly encourage you to read it if you haven't. It's called The Art of War. One of the key messages in The Art of War is if you have to engage the enemy in battle, you've already lost the war. And what happens if you develop the conviction that we need to change, change is urgent and necessary, your immediate temptation is to confront the enemies of change. Do battle, get it over with, win the battle and move on. My advice is resist that temptation. In fact, delay for as long as humanly possible any confrontation between the enemies of change and the champions of change, until the champions have become so strong and the enemies so weak that a battle isn't even necessary. It's a foregone conclusion as to who's going to win. That's very hard to do in practice, but at least from my experience, that's absolutely important. In that context, my belief is the top-down, what I call the top-down Big Bang approaches to change are doomed to failure. An executive gets up, announces that we need to change everything. We're a large company, it's going to cost a lot of money. We're a large company, it's going to take a long time. You can't turn around a battleship overnight. But at the end of all that, wonderful things are going to happen. What that person has just done is put on their back a bullseye and invited all the antibodies and the immune system of the organization to mobilize to attack. It's going to cost a lot of money. Where's that money coming from? It's going to take a long time. I got quarterly numbers to meet. I need those resources for that. So, is there an alternative? I only have 3 minutes to give you a hint of it, but again, hopefully this evening can give you a little more exposure to it. It's something that we call scaling edges. It's an approach that says rather than trying to do top-down, Big Bang approach to change, or the alternative approach that's become more popular now is skunk works. You create some skunk works out on the edge, and You build it up a little bit, get to some critical mass, and then you shove that skunkworks back into the core and use it as a catalyst for change. Our experience is those efforts, the immune system is very good at identifying these foreign bodies and mobilizing to attack as they come back in. The alternative approach of scaling edges is no, start on an edge, but identify an edge to the company that, because of these exponential forces that are at work and the big shift that we've been talking about, has the potential to scale to the point where it could actually become the new core of your business. Not just a diversification, a little product adjunct, or a new business initiative. No, actually could become the core of your business in terms of profits and revenues generated. And then focus on scaling that edge, and over time, pulling more and more of the people and resources from the core out to the edge, to the point where it becomes the new core. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge there aren't a lot of great examples of scaling edges fully played out. There's one illustration that I'll just share with you because I already mentioned the company. It's called Li & Fung, that Chinese company. Li & Fung is actually a very old company. They started in Hong Kong over 100 years ago. Most of their life, until the 1970s, Li & Fung was a classic broker business. They connected an apparel designer in the West with a manufacturing plant in China. They took a commission, did the deal, and moved on to the next deal. Two brothers took over the company in the mid-1970s, and they were under increasing margin pressure on those commissions, and they said, we got to change. This is not sustainable. And they engaged, actually, they didn't describe it at the time, it was intuitive, but they engaged in a zoom out, zoom in kind of approach. And they zoomed out and said the apparel industry is becoming more complex on a global scale, and apparel designers need somebody who can be their trusted advisor, who can basically help them to navigate through an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world out there. And again, rather than going in and announcing to the organization, we're changing everything, they created a small business unit on the side. It was the Calvin Klein business unit. It had 3 people in it. And the assignment for those 3 people was go out to the Calvin Klein organization and basically live with them, get to know them better than they know themselves, and become more and more helpful to them in terms of connecting to relevant resources around the world. Long story short, that business unit scaled very rapidly. They tapped into an unmet need that the Calvin Klein organization had, and they scaled that very rapidly. And then they started adding other business units for other apparel designers. And over time, that became the core of their business. And at the end of the day, the few deal makers that were left, the ones who were collecting those commissions for the broker deals, basically ended up leaving because they weren't part of this new business. They couldn't understand, why would I spend time developing deep relationships, trust-based relationships? I'm a deal guy. So interesting transition, fundamental transformation of the company, but they scaled an edge rather than going in to try to transform the core. And I'll just say as one last comment that my belief is that if we get this right, I like to say I'm from Silicon Valley and I'm a genetic optimist. I believe we are, one way of describing the big shift is we are moving from a set of business models that basically are characterized by diminishing returns. I started my career at Boston Consulting Group, BCG, many years ago. And at the time, exaggeration, they made their business on one chart. It was called the experience curve. They were describing and quantifying operating performance improvement in industry after industry. They started with semiconductors, they went out to everything from Japanese beer to toilet paper, and they found the experience curve was a very accurate descriptor of how performance improved in a market or industry over time. Very accurate, but the problem was it was a diminishing returns curve. The more experience you accumulated in a market or industry, the longer and harder you had to work to get that next increment of performance improvement. Our belief is the big shift, for those who make that transition, that shift, opens up the possibility for the first time of a business world that is driven by increasing returns, where the more who participate and the more experience that's gathered, the more value that gets created for everyone. That's a very different and very exciting business world, and I'm looking forward to being part of it. Thank you very much.